Hey everybody, and welcome back to part 2 of page formatting here in Dorico Pro 6. So in the last video, we talked about the engraving and notation options that we like to set before we get started with page layout because they affect the page layout so much. And today what we're going to be focusing on is the system spacing. Now, what do we mean by system spacing? So in music, a system is a group of individual staves or staffs, if you're in America, that make up one measure of music, meaning all of these things are happening at once. The best example of this is a score. A score might have 10 staves on it, and measure 1 through measure 5 are on page 1, which would be system number 1. Now, it is perfectly plausible to have more than one system per page, especially if you only have one stave. For example, an alto sax part only has one stave on it, but then it has multiple systems on the page. And this distinction is important because it's going to affect how we change the settings in Dorico Pro. So to begin with, I have open this big band score for Strawberry Fields Forever, and what we're going to be editing is the distances between the different staves in the system. Now, this is a little different than when we're working on an individual part, but to me, I always get my score going first before I worry about parts, because I always figure the score is going to take me the longest. So let's dive right in. So the first menu we're going to visit is the layout options, which is under the library menu in Dorico. Now, in the layout options, we are presented with the same kind of menu we had in the engrave and the notation options, and we have options for saving defaults. It's not a bad idea to think about saving some defaults here, but I'll be honest with you. I go in and I change these settings on almost every single document, even if I'm using a template, because the spacing is dictated by so many different factors, including the complexity of the music, the number of instruments you have working, the kinds of instruments. Are these instruments that have high notes or very low notes that are outside of the staff? And you can see that always having to deal with these options. Although it's not a bad idea to save some defaults, I think you're going to find you're going to end up having to come in and change a lot of these. Now, to begin with, you might be tempted to start editing a whole bunch of these different options like the rastral size and the note spacing, but 9 times out of 10, I think the best way to get started with score is to look at your vertical spacing, which has to do with how far apart each line of music is. So here on page 10 of the score, you can see that pretty much every instrument is playing, so we have a good representation of all of the different instruments so that the spacing will have the most impact. When we look at the layout option, there are a couple of different things to note. The first thing is this staff-to-staff spacing. Now, staff-to-staff spacing is the distance between any two regular staffs in the score. And so that means the larger that this number is, the farther apart each individual staff is in our score. So to begin with, I'm just going to set this to 0 for a minute, and it's going to squish all of our music together as much as it possibly can. Now, there is a caveat to anything we do in these minimum gaps, which is if we have the auto avoidance collision turned on, then that means that it's going to overwrite the spacing to try and make the music still look good even if we have minimum spaces. You can see that on this page 10, when I changed the spacing to 0, it almost didn't change it. But over here on page 11, it really squished the score together to make it take up far less white space. And so that's the power of that auto avoidance. But for right now, to prove my point, I'm going to go ahead and turn that off and hit apply. Now you can see with the staff spacing set to 0, all of the staves are squished together, frankly unusably. But you'll notice that the groups of different staves are still spread apart, and that's where these other categories come in. So the different options we have here under the minimum gaps are a little bit confusing when you just read the names, and sometimes you might have to experiment with which one Dorico is going to use to change the group we're talking about. But I think if we look at the icons on the left, it really helps us understand. So this first one here says staff group to staff spacing. So that means it's looking for a staff group, aka has a brace on it, going to a unbraced stave, like for example, going down here to my guitar part from my fourth trombone. So if I was to lower that to 4, for example, you'll see that it pulls the guitar part up next to that staff group. By the inverse, you have a single stave to a staff group. So this would pull this piano part up toward my guitar part. Now, next we have the staff group to staff group. So that's going to be the distance between the saxes, the trumpets, and the trombones. So again, if I change that to 4, you'll see it crushes the groups together. Then we have braced staff to braced staff, which is the distance between the left hand and the right hand of the piano and the grand staff. So if I make that 4, the piano squishes together. And you can see that I actually squished it together so much, it actually pulled a whole nother system onto my page. Then finally, we have braced staff group to unbraced staff, which would be the piano part going down to the bass part. So again, if I make that 4. And finally, the last 3 categories, Osaya, tab notation, and time code. I don't use those a ton, but obviously it's pretty self-explanatory. If you had a time code for a movie score, for example, that's the spacing it's going to give it. Now, because we actually pulled a second stave up onto our page, that's where this inner system gap comes in. The inner system gap is the distance between 2 different systems, not staves. And so if I was to change this to 10, you'll see that it pulls this system closer to my original system. Now, obviously, I've made a mess of my score by condensing everything too much and turning off the auto avoidance. But this is a good representation of how we want to think about creating good spacing. I would like my music to look really good without the auto avoidance being turned on first, and then let the auto avoidance take care of any small problems that come across. I think visually it looks better when your score looks fairly uniform from page 1 to page 2, and I don't want page 3 to look totally spread out because there was a lot of action, and then on page 4 where no one's playing, it all gets squished together. I think that's really distracting for reading a part. So we want everything to look pretty uniform. So I always start with my minimum gaps first, and I don't hesitate to go ahead and turn off that auto avoidance to make sure that everything is looking the way I want before I turn that on as kind of a backup, if you will. Now, to begin, we need to set our staff to staff spacing to a number that'll be functional. Now, remember, this is the distance between alto 1, alto 2, trumpet 1, trumpet 2, and so on and so forth. So it's going to affect the majority of our staves in our score. Now, I'm going to go ahead and try this at 4 because typically speaking, I think we overspace our scores a little bit too much. Now, you can see that set on 4, it went ahead and it pushed that second system back off our page, but you can see it's still too close together. We're definitely overlapping trumpet parts on top of trumpet parts and sax parts on sax parts. One thing to look for in your score when you're trying to find your spacing is, remember, items like text blocks and dynamics go below or above the stave, which means you're going to get collisions. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and turn this up to, say, 6 3/4. Now, you can type in these numbers, but you do have to actually type in the fraction. You cannot put 6.75. Dorico requires that you use the fractions. So that's starting to look pretty good. It's not quite right yet, but it's giving me a nice looking separation. And you can see here where I don't have a text block, it actually looks pretty darn good having a crescendo with the dynamics. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to push apart my groups. I like my trumpets to be pulled a little bit farther away from my saxes because I typically find the first trumpet, which plays high notes, and the bari sax, which plays low notes, they'll tend to conflict. So I like to put a little extra space there. So I'm going to go down to my group to group, and I'm going to change this to 8. And now you can see the distance between my bari sax and my first trumpet are looking pretty darn good. It's actually feeling pretty well spaced, but it's still so close to the spacing of the regular staves, they don't look separated. Plus, you can see my fourth trumpet and my first trombone are still colliding. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that up to, say, 10. Now you can see the groups are pulled apart a little farther, which I like the look of, and it gives me a little more separation in my score. Now, because the guitar part does not belong to a group, it's still crammed up against my fourth trombone. And because this is a group stave going to an ungrouped stave, I'm going to come up here to staff group to staff, and I'm going to change this to 10 so it mirrors the group spacing from above. Now you can see the chord symbols in the guitar and the dynamics in fourth trombone are no longer colliding. Now we need to get the guitar spaced away from our piano. And although the piano is a braced stave, it's still kind of considered a group. We're going to go ahead and change the single stave to the group staff, and I'm going to go ahead and set that to 10 as well. Now, I oftentimes will spread apart my rhythm sections farther than my regular instruments because they almost always will have chord symbols, which means they need a little bit more white space. Now we see down here in the bass part, in the drum part, and the vocal part, we're still getting a fair amount of collision. And that's because these are all individual staffs, so they are controlled by our first option here, the staff to staff. So I'm going to go ahead and crank this up just a little farther. Let's say 7.5. Now everything is starting to look pretty well spaced. There might be a collision here and there, but everything's looking pretty good. Except for my piano part, you can see that I'm squeezing that. So I'm going to go ahead and take that back up to 6. All right. Now you can see, on average, every single page looks pretty good. You can see we have a minor collision here. For the most part, everything is looking pretty good. Now you can see this is why I give a little extra space to things like my rhythm section parts, because chord symbols oftentimes will run into the dynamic of the staff above it. So now that everything feels pretty good, this is where I would go ahead and turn on my auto collision. And this should take care of most of these little problems. Now we can see we still have a problem here on page 12. The bari sax, the alto sax, they're colliding with each other because the staff spacing between those is a little bit too big. So when the auto collision turns on, it doesn't have enough room to push things apart. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this down a little bit to see if I can't use the two in conjunction to make things look a little more uniform. Now, it seems as if no matter how hard I try, I can't seem to get my spacing to be correct here, and I can't get rid of my collisions. So this is where we can start dealing with things like the rastral size, meaning if I make the music smaller, then I can get my spacing correct. So I'm going to go back up to my page setup, and under my rastral size here, I'm going to go ahead and turn that down to 0.04 instead of 0.042. Now, you might think 1/1000th of an inch, are you crazy? But let me tell you, on 1/1000th of an inch is a noticeable amount when it comes to this rastral size. Now, when I go back to my chord symbols here where I had my solo section, you can see that I'm coming much closer to having the correct spacing, and I have far fewer collisions. And so maybe I'm going to go ahead and turn that down 2 more. And now you can see I no longer have collisions between my chord symbols and my dynamics, but now we have the problem of, look, on page 10, everything looks pretty good, but page 9 looks kind of squished. So we have 2 options here to fix this vertical spacing. One, we could go in and we could increase the staff-to-staff space to make it so the whole thing is spread out a little more, or we can turn on justification. So under vertical spacing, if we go down to vertical justification, you can see that we have these options to justify distance between staves and systems when the frame is at least a percent. Now, a lot of times I try and turn this off by going ahead and changing that to 100%. But in this case, I actually want it to spread my staves out a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and change this number much lower to 60 because I want it to turn on. And now you can see, because on page 10, the bottom stave was actually basically at the bottom of my musical frame, it spread out page 11 to look much more like page 10. Now, the auto collision avoidance made it so that it would go ahead and squish the staves together a little bit when there was a little extra white space. But that's why I say I like the auto collision to do a little bit, because here it avoided the collision between my chord symbols and my text. But on this page, it made it so that it spread out really nicely. And it makes it so that when I'm scrolling across the pages as the conductor of the band, I don't think to myself, oh man, what stave am I on? Where am I here? So in closing, when we're dealing with vertical spacing in our score, the first place we always need to go is our minimum gaps, and we oftentimes should turn off the collision avoidance so that we can see that our score is spacing out in a way that we like, and then turn that setting back on so that as we continue to change our score, it will help us just avoid those last few collisions. Once we have gotten the vertical spacing looking really good, then we can go ahead and turn on that vertical justification to make sure that a page that has very little notation on it doesn't look squished together in comparison to the rest of our score. So again, thanks so much for watching. I hope you'll stick around for the next video in the series as I start to talk about part formatting in the same way we were looking at score formatting. If you're enjoying these videos and you want a little extra help, remember you can visit my website at larsenjazz.com. You can email me with questions about private lessons or other things. Make sure you also check out some of my new music coming out. I have an album that's going to be released on August 1st called Singularity with some fantastic musicians, and I hope you'll check that out on your favorite streaming service. Again, like and subscribe the videos. It really helps the channel and it keeps me working on these great videos. And I hope you'll join us again for the next segment. Have a great day.